Chapter 37. The first thing Martin did next morning was to go counter both to Brissenden's advice and command. The shame of the sun he wrapped and mailed to the Acropolis. He believed he could find magazine publication for it, and he felt that recognition by the magazines would commend him to the book-publishing houses. Ephemera he likewise wrapped and mailed to a magazine. Despite Brissenden's prejudice against the magazines, which was a pronounced mania with him, Martin decided that the great poem should see print. He did not intend, however, to publish it without the other's permission. His plan was to get it accepted by one of the high magazines, and, thus armed, again to wrestle with Brissenden for consent. Martin began, that morning, a story which he had sketched out a number of weeks before, and which ever since had been worrying him with its insistent clamor to be created. Apparently, it was to be a rattling sea story, a tale of 20th century adventure and romance, handling real characters in a real world under real conditions. Beneath the swing and go of the story was to be something else, something that the superficial reader would never discern and which, on the other hand, would not diminish in any way the interest and enjoyment for such a reader. It was this, and not the mere story, that impelled Martin to write it. For that matter, it was always the great, universal motif that suggested plots to him. After having found such a motif, he cast about for the particular persons and particular locations in time and space, wherewith and wherein to utter the universal thing. Overdue was the title he had decided for it, and its length, he believed, would not be more than 60,000 words, a bagatelle for him with his splendid vigor of production. On this first day, he took hold of it with conscious delight in the mastery of his tools. He no longer worried for fear that the sharp, cutting edges should slip and mar his work. The long months of intense application and study had brought their reward. He could now devote himself with sure hand to the larger phases of the thing he shaped, and as he worked, hour after hour, he felt, as never before, the sure and cosmic grasp with which he held life and the affairs of life. Overdue would tell a story that would be true of its particular characters and its particular events, but it would tell, too, he was confident, great vital things that would be true of all time and all sea and all life. Thanks to Herbert Spencer, he thought, leaning back for a moment from the table. Aye, thanks to Herbert Spencer and to the master key of life, evolution, which Spencer had placed in his hands. He was conscious it was great stuff he was writing. It will go, was the refrain that kept sounding in his ears. Of course it would go. At last he was turning out the thing at which the magazines would jump. The whole story worked out before him in lightning flashes. He broke off from it long enough to write a paragraph in his notebook. This would be the last paragraph in Overdue. But so thoroughly was the whole book already composed in his brain that he could write, weeks before he had arrived at the end itself. He compared the tale, as yet unwritten, with the tales from the sea writers, and he felt it to be immeasurably superior. "There's only one man who could touch it," he murmured aloud, "and that's Conrad. And it ought to make even him sit up and shake hands with me and say, 'Well done, Martin, my boy.'" He toiled on all day, recollecting, at the last moment, that he was to have dinner at the Morses. Thanks to Brissenden, his black suit was out of pawn, and he was again eligible for dinner parties. Downtown he stopped off long enough to run into the library and search for Saleeby's books. He drew out The Cycle of Life, and on the car turned to the essay Norton had mentioned on Spencer. As Martin read, he grew angry. His face flushed, his jaw set, and unconsciously his hand clenched, unclenched, and clenched again, as if he were taking fresh grips upon some hateful thing, out of which he was squeezing the life. When he left the car, he strode along the sidewalks as a wrathful man will stride, and he rang the Morse bell with such viciousness that it roused him to consciousness of his condition, so that he entered in good nature, smiling with amusement at himself. No sooner, however, was he inside, than a great depression descended upon him. He fell from the height where he had been upborne all day on the wings of inspiration. Bourgeois, trader's den, Brissenden's epithets repeated themselves in his mind. What of that? He demanded angrily. He was marrying Ruth, not her family. It seemed to him that he had never seen Ruth more beautiful, more spiritual and ethereal, and at the same time more healthy. There was color in her cheeks, and her eyes drew him again and again, the eyes in which he had first read immortality. He had forgotten immortality of late, and the trend of his scientific reading had been away from it, but here, in Ruth's eyes, he read an argument without words that transcended all worded arguments. He saw that in her eyes before which all discussion fled away, for he saw love there. And in his own eyes was love, and love was unanswerable. Such was his passionate doctrine. The half hour he had been with her, before they went in to dinner, left him supremely happy and supremely satisfied with life. Nevertheless, at table, the inevitable reaction and exhaustion consequent upon the hard day seized hold of him. He was aware that his eyes were tired, and that he was irritable. He remembered it was at this table, at which he now sneered and was so often bored, that he had first eaten with civilized beings in what he had imagined was an atmosphere of high culture and refinement. He caught a glimpse of that pathetic figure of him so long ago, a self-conscious savage, sprouting sweat at every pore in an agony of apprehension, puzzled by the bewildering minutiae of eating implements, tortured by the ogre of a servant, striving at a leap to live at such dizzy social altitude, and deciding in the end to be frankly himself, pretending no knowledge and no polish he did not possess. He glanced at Ruth for reassurance, much in the same manner that a passenger with sudden panic thought of possible shipwreck will strive to locate the life preservers. Well, that much had come out of it, love and Ruth. All the rest had failed to stand the test of the books. But Ruth and love had stood the test. For them he found a biological sanction. Love was the most exalted expression of life. Nature had been busy designing him, as she had been busy with all normal men, for the purpose of loving. She had spent 10,000 centuries, aye, 100,000 and 1,000,000 centuries, upon the task, and he was the best she could do. She had made love the strongest thing in him, increased its power a myriad %, with her gift of imagination, and sent him forth into the ephemera to thrill and melt and mate. His hand sought Ruth's hand beside him, hidden by the table, and a warm pressure was given and received. She looked at him a swift instant, and her eyes were radiant and melting. So were his in the thrill that pervaded him, nor did he realize how much that was radiant and melting in her eyes had been aroused by what she had seen in his. Across the table from him, cater-cornered, at Mr. Morse's right, sat Judge Blount, a local superior court judge. Martin had met him a number of times and had failed to like him. He and Ruth's father were discussing labor union politics, the local situation, and socialism, and Mr. Morse was endeavoring to twit Martin on the latter topic. At last, Judge Blount looked across the table with benignant and fatherly pity. Martin smiled to himself. "You'll grow out of it, young man," he said soothingly. "Time is the best cure for such youthful distempers." He turned to Mr. Morse. "I do not believe discussion is good in such cases. It makes the patient obstinate." "That is true," the other assented gravely. "But it is well to warn the patient occasionally of his condition." Martin laughed merrily, but it was with an effort. The day had been too long, the day's effort too intense, and he was deep in the throes of the reaction. "Undoubtedly you are both excellent doctors," he said. "But if you care a whit for the opinion of the patient, Let him tell you that you are poor diagnosticians. In fact, you are both suffering from the disease you think you find in me. As for me, I am immune. The socialist philosophy that riots half-baked in your veins has passed me by. Clever, clever, murmured the judge. An excellent ruse in controversy, to reverse positions. Out of your mouth. Martin's eyes were sparkling, but he kept control of himself. You see, Judge, I've heard your campaign speeches. By some henidical process, henidical, by the way, is a favorite word of mine which nobody understands. By some henidical process you persuade yourself that you believe in the competitive system and the survival of the strong, and at the same time you endorse with might and main all sorts of measures to shear the strength from the strong. My young man, remember, I've heard your campaign speeches, Martin warned. It's on record, your position on interstate commerce regulation, on regulation of the Railway Trust and Standard Oil, on the conservation of the forests, on 1,001 restrictive measures that are nothing else than socialistic. Do you mean to tell me that you do not believe in regulating these various outrageous exercises of power? That's not the point. I mean to tell you that you are a poor diagnostician. I mean to tell you that I am not suffering from the microbe of socialism. I mean to tell you that it is you who are suffering from the emasculating ravages of that same microbe. As for me, I am an inveterate opponent of socialism, just as I am an inveterate opponent of your mongrel democracy. That is nothing else than pseudo-socialism, masquerading under a garb of words that will not stand the test of the dictionary. I am a reactionary, so completely reactionary that my position is incomprehensible to you, who live in a veiled lie of social organization, and whose sight is not keen enough to pierce the veil. You make believe that you believe in the survival of the strong and the rule of the strong. I believe. That is the difference. When I was a trifle younger, a few months younger, I believed the same thing. You see, the ideas of you and yours had impressed me. But merchants and traders are cowardly rulers at best. They grunt and grub all their days in the trough of money-getting. And I have swung back to aristocracy, if you please. I am the only individualist in this room. I look to the state for nothing. I look only to the strong man, the man on horseback, to save the state from its own rotten futility. Nietzsche was right. I won't take the time to tell you who Nietzsche was, but he was right. The world belongs to the strong who are noble as well, and who do not wallow in the swine trough of trade and exchange. The world belongs to the true noblemen, to the great blond beasts, to the non-compromisers, to the yes-sayers, and they will eat you up, you socialists who are afraid of socialism and who think yourselves individualists. Your slave morality of the meek and lowly will never save you. Oh, it's all Greek, I know, and I won't bother you any more with it. But remember one thing. There aren't half a dozen individualists in Oakland, but Martin Eden is one of them. He signified that he was done with the discussion and turned to Ruth. I'm wrought up today, he said in an undertone. All I want to do is love, not talk. He ignored Mr. Morse, who said, I am unconvinced. All socialists are Jesuits. That is the way to tell them. We'll make a good Republican out of you yet, said Judge Blount. The man on horseback will arrive before that time, Martin retorted with good humor, and returned to Ruth. But Mr. Morse was not content. He did not like the laziness and the disinclination for sober, legitimate work of this prospective son-in-law of his, for whose ideas he had no respect, and of whose nature he had no understanding. So he turned the conversation to Herbert Spencer. Judge Blount ably seconded him, and Martin, whose ears had pricked at the first mention of the philosopher's name, listened to the judge enunciate a grave and complacent diatribe against Spencer. From time to time, Mr. Morse glanced at Martin, as much as to say, "There, my boy, you see." "Chattering daws," Martin muttered under his breath and went on talking with Ruth and Arthur. But the long day and the real dirt of the night before were telling upon him, and besides, still burning in his mind, was what had made him angry when he read it on the car. "What is the matter?" Ruth asked suddenly, alarmed by the effort he was making to contain himself. "There is no God but the unknowable, and Herbert Spencer is its prophet," Judge Blount was saying at that moment. Martin turned upon him. "A cheap judgment," he remarked quietly. "I heard it first in the City Hall Park, on the lips of a working man who ought to have known better. I have heard it often since, and each time the claptrap of it nauseates me. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. To hear that great and noble man's name upon your lips is like finding a dewdrop in a cesspool. You are disgusting." It was like a thunderbolt. Judge Blount glared at him with apoplectic countenance, and silence reigned. Mr. Morse was secretly pleased. He could see that his daughter was shocked. It was what he wanted to do, to bring out the innate ruffianism of this man he did not like. Ruth's hand sought Martin's beseechingly under the table, but his blood was up. He was inflamed by the intellectual pretense and fraud of those who sat in the high places. A superior court judge. It was only several years before that he had looked up from the mire at such glorious entities and deemed them gods. Judge Blount recovered himself and attempted to go on, addressing himself to Martin with an assumption of politeness that the latter understood was for the benefit of the ladies. Even this added to his anger. Was there no honesty in the world? "You can't discuss Spencer with me," he cried. "You do not know any more about Spencer than do his own countrymen, but it is no fault of yours, I grant. It is just a phase of the contemptible ignorance of the times. I ran across a sample of it on my way here this evening. I was reading an essay by Saleeby on Spencer. You should read it. It is accessible to all men. You can buy it in any bookstore or draw it from the public library. You would feel ashamed of your paucity of abuse and ignorance of that noble man, compared with what Saleeby has collected on the subject. It is a record of shame that would shame your shame. The philosopher of the half-educated, he was called by an academic philosopher, who was not worthy to pollute the atmosphere he breathed. I don't think you have read 10 pages of Spencer, but there have been critics, assumably more intelligent than you, who have read no more than you of Spencer, who publicly challenged his followers to adduce one single idea from all his writings. From Herbert Spencer's writings, the man who has impressed the stamp of his genius over the whole field of scientific research and modern thought, the father of psychology, the man who revolutionized pedagogy, so that today the child of the French peasant is taught the 3 R's according to principles laid down by him. And the little gnats of men sting his memory when they get their very bread and butter from the technical application of his ideas. What little of worth resides in their brains is largely due to him. It is certain that had he never lived, most of what is correct in their parrot-learned knowledge would be absent. And yet a man like Professor Fairbanks of Oxford, a man who sits in an even higher place than you, Judge Blount, has said that Spencer will be dismissed by posterity as a poet and dreamer rather than a thinker. Yappers and blatherskites, the whole brood of them. First Principles is not wholly destitute of a certain literary power, said one of them. And others of them have said that he was an industrious plodder rather than an original thinker. Yappers and blatherskites, yappers and blatherskites. Martin ceased abruptly in a dead silence. Everybody in Ruth's family looked up to Judge Blount as a man of power and achievement, and they were horrified at Martin's outbreak. The remainder of the dinner passed like a funeral, the judge and Mr. Morse confining their talk to each other, and the rest of the conversation being extremely desultory. Then afterward, when Ruth and Martin were alone, there was a scene. "You are unbearable," she wept. But his anger still smoldered, and he kept muttering, "The beasts! The beasts!" When she averred he had insulted the judge, he retorted, by telling the truth about him? I don't care whether it was true or not, she insisted. There are certain bounds of decency, and you had no license to insult anybody. Then where did Judge Blount get the license to assault the truth? Martin demanded. Surely to assault truth is a more serious misdemeanor than to insult a pygmy personality such as the judge's. He did worse than that. He blackened the name of a great noble man who is dead. Oh, the beasts, the beasts. His complex anger flamed afresh, and Ruth was in terror of him. Never had she seen him so angry, and it was all mystified and unreasonable to her comprehension. And yet, through her very terror, ran the fibers of fascination that had drawn and that still drew her to him, that had compelled her to lean towards him and, in that mad culminating moment, lay her hands upon his neck. She was hurt and outraged by what had taken place, and yet she lay in his arms and quivered while he went on muttering, "The beasts, the beasts." And she still lay there when he said, "I'll not bother your table again, dear. They do not like me, and it is wrong of me to thrust my objectionable presence upon them. Besides, they are just as objectionable to me. Faugh! They are sickening. And to think of it, I dreamed in my innocence that the persons who sat in the high places, who lived in fine houses, and had educations and bank accounts, were worth while." End of chapter 37.